और हम तो किन शब्दों मेरे पास we do not have any words for you, Dr. Aseem. We all Indian welcome you as Indian. You are our hero. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you, Ashutosh. I don't think I deserved any of that. I'm just one medium for spreading the truth here, and we're all part of a team effort. And I'm really honoured to be here. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. Peter McCullough has been, at this from the beginning. I've come in a bit later, but really, ultimately, if we're going to win this battle, it's going to take a team effort. So we're all working together to be mediums to spread the truth, and that's what we're here for. So I'm going to talk over the next 45 minutes to an hour or so bear with me, on my journey of COVID-19 and the vaccines. So I think before we get on to the main topic, I think we have to understand that a lot of people here are part of an echo chamber, if you like, right? A lot of us are already kind of converted, if you like, to the more truthful message. But the real challenge we have is how do we break through that message to people who are not already on our side, if you like, who are not open or haven't been exposed to the truthful message. So there are 3 psychological phenomena I think we need to understand and appreciate if we are going to break through. The first one is a willful blindness. So that is when and we're all capable of this, by the way, in different circumstances. So this is when human beings turn a blind eye to the truth in order to feel safe, in order to protect prestige, avoid conflict, and reduce anxiety. That's the first thing. So that's willful blindness, and we have many historical examples of this happening throughout history. The second phenomenon is one of fear. Many people are still gripped by fear from the COVID-19 pandemic, almost a form of PTSD, if you like. And the problem with fear is it clouds our ability to engage in critical thinking. Even the brightest minds can be affected by this. And the third phenomenon, which I think applies in many ways to policymakers and academics, is that changing one's mind can be one of the most terrifying experiences a human being can go through. The Canadian-American economist John Kenneth Galbraith said that faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving there's no reason to do so, almost everybody gets busy on the proof. But accepting and understanding these facts, I think, allows people and opens them up to maybe being more, in terms of the way we communicate it, but also in terms of the way they receive. And of course, the late great Stephen Hawking actually said, in fact, this is actually an evolution. This is a thought of the Buddha. I'm a big follower of the Buddha in recent years. I've become very spiritual. What's worse than ignorance? The illusion of knowledge. Okay, so now I know the WHO aren't necessarily in the good books of this organization today, and they have done a lot of things wrong, but one of the things I do really appreciate is their definition of health. So when we talk about the bigger picture of what we're dealing with here, that definition of health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. How do we achieve that? Well, I'm going to talk you through a little bit of the findings of my paper, which I published in the Journal of Insulin Resistance. But to start off with, as a doctor, my primary purpose is to improve my patient outcomes. That means managing risks, treating illness, and last but not least, relieving suffering. Everything I do as a doctor is predicated on that principle. And how do you get there? Now, this is a very elegant analytical framework that is now more than 25 years old, but unfortunately is not being implemented in the way it should be. We do this from our clinical experience, our clinical intuition, our knowledge as doctors, using the best available evidence, and last but not least, in fact the most important, is taking into consideration individual patient preferences and values. Because if you don't do that, whatever you suggest is not going to work. You'll get non-compliance. You have to empower patients, and this is informed consent. So the problem is this. Evidence-based medicine has become an illusion. Evidence-based medicine has been hijacked by very powerful vested interests, and as a result, we have a complete healthcare system failure, and I would say a pandemic of misinformed doctors and misinformed and unwittingly harmed patients, based upon a number of factors. I'm an evidence-based guy. I love mathematics. I love numbers. I'm a root cause analysis guy. So let's go through these, right? What are the problems with the best available evidence? Because if a doctor is making clinical decisions on commercially biased or corrupted information, at best it's going to do suboptimal outcomes for our patients, and at worst it's going to do harm, and that's where we're at. So what are these factors? Well, biased funding of research. That's research that's funded because it's likely to be profitable, not beneficial for patients. Biased reporting in medical journals. Biased patient pamphlets. Biased reporting in the media. We'll come on to that later. Commercial conflicts of interest. Defensive medicine. And last but not least, medical curricula that fail to teach doctors how to comprehend and communicate health statistics. Without understanding the numbers involved, doctors, patients, and members of the public are vulnerable to exploitation of their hopes and fears by commercial and political interests. So let's break down the numbers. That's so important. Let's break it down in a way that people can understand. So John Ioannidis, I describe as a Stephen Hawking-like figure in medicine. He's professor of medicine and epidemiology and statistics at the University of Stanford. He's the most cited medical scientist in the world. And in this paper in 2017, which is called How to Survive Medical Misinformation Mess, he describes that 30 to 50% of all healthcare activity in the United States brings no benefit to the patients, and that most doctors are unaware of all of the poor quality research that contributes to overuse of medications, underuse of safer, cheaper options, and even lifestyle interventions, waste, missed opportunities for right care, and avoidable adverse events. And these are the main factors behind it, right? So this is an important thing that people need to understand. Everybody needs to know this. Much published research is not reliable, offers no benefit to patients, and is not useful to decision makers. Most healthcare professionals are not aware of this problem. Most doctors don't know these failings in the system that contribute to their clinical decision making. They then lack the necessary skills to evaluate the reliability and usefulness of medical science. And then last but not least, again, patients and families then lack relevant, accurate medical evidence and skilled guidance at the time of medical decision making. Now, ignorance of this problem, even at the highest levels of academic and clinical leadership, is profound. Peter mentioned earlier, referenced the former director of the CDC, Rochelle Walensky, who said that her optimism from the vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine, came from CNN. The CNN news report, where her optimism came, was almost verbatim reproduction of Pfizer's press release. Think about that. My own experience, I gave a talk last year at the British Medical Association conference at one of their meetings. One of the attendees was the chair of the British Medical Association, Dr. Chan Nagpal. He was shocked and couldn't believe when I told him that our regulator in the UK, our medical regulator, gets most of its funding from pharma. He didn't know that. When I spoke to him, when I was campaigning to overturn vaccine mandates for healthcare staff, I spent 2 hours, a very open guy, he said to me, Aseem, and from everyone I've spoken to, including people like the chief medical officer and health policy makers, he said, nobody appears to have critically appraised the evidence as well as you have. Most of these people are getting their information from the BBC. Now, another thing that John Ioannidis in his he is a great mathematician, he's a statistician. One of his calculations, he wrote this paper in PLOS One in 2001, and said why most published research findings are false. In other words, certainly when there is commercial interest involved, those publications, which is most of drug industry-sponsored research, the conclusions exaggerate the safety and benefit of their interventions, okay? And he says the greater the financial or other interests and prejudices in a scientific field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. So I've been campaigning on this for many, many years, issue. I spoke in the European Parliament in 2018, and I made some clear, some very key points there. I think that people, again, need to appreciate when we look at the root cause of the problem. The pharmaceutical industry have a legal obligation to produce profit for their shareholders. They do not have a legal requirement to give you the best treatment. But the real scandals are these. The regulators fail to prevent misconduct by industry, and that doctors, academic institutions, and medical journals that have a responsibility to patients and scientific integrity collude with industry for financial gain. And I said the situation has become so dire, the honest doctors can no longer practice honest medicine. Now let's give you some brief history of the pharmaceutical industry, because that's where we're going here in terms of root cause of the problem. So there's extensive research and evidence on fraud committed by the pharmaceutical industry. Most of the top 10 drug companies, certainly between 2009 and 2014, were found to have committed fraud in the United States, totaling about $14 billion in fines for illegal marketing of drugs, hiding data on harms, manipulation of results, for example. And Peter Gosha, the co-founder of the Cochrane collaboration, says the situation is not resolving itself, because what happens is the fines are so small, they end up making more profit from the drugs that they've illegally marketed, right? So the crime is essentially paying. He said we need to create a situation where the fines are so large that drug companies risk going bankrupt, and that senior executives involved in these frauds need to go to jail, right? And that will act as an effective deterrent. People, let's play devil's advocate here, but Dr. Malhotra, isn't the drug company responsible for saving so many lives, etc., etc.? Yes, there are many drugs that are being produced by the pharmaceutical industry that are life-saving and beneficial in the right patient, okay? But what is the net effect of these drug companies, certainly the last couple of decades? This is one analysis done in France between 2002 and 2011. Almost 1,000 drugs were approved by their regulator. Most of the drugs were copies of old ones. So they change a few molecules here and there. They patent these drugs. Huge waste in the system. The taxpayer, we pay for this, okay? And then when they looked at harmful drugs versus, clinically therapeutic drugs that were, new, innovative, double the amount of drugs that were found to be more harmful than beneficial. So 15.6% of the drugs were found to be more harmful than beneficial, and over 8% that were thought to be of therapeutic value. So what do we conclude by this? The overall, and this is being repeated everywhere, this is being repeated in the United States. Marcy Angel, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, considered the most high-impact medical journal in the world. She did her own analysis saying that 75% of drugs in the US are found to be copies of old ones. One of the reasons for this is drug companies now spend 20 times more on marketing than they do on basic science research. So the system is not even encouraging good innovation. The system is rigged against the population, against innovation, but for the profits of these big companies. And Marcy Angel says it is no longer possible to trust much of the clinical research that's published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authorities of medical guidelines, and she reluctantly reached this conclusion over almost 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. She's not alone. Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet, he came to one of my recent talks recently, I'll tell you about that later, and I cited him in my talk, and he said, in his editorial in 2015, he said possibly half of the medical published literature may simply be untrue. Right? This is not conspiracy theories here. These are people at the very cutting edge. These are leading medical journal editors who are saying this. And it fits with the data. Right? And of course, there's a big problem in British institutions of research misconduct. Richard Smith, former editor of the BMJ, in a meeting that in a talk he gave to some leading academics in the UK, he asked the audience of academics. He said, "How many of you are aware of fraud or manipulation of data taking place in your own department?" Right, and these are some of the most prestigious British institutions. A third of the audience put their hand up. He said, "How many of you have reported it?" They all put their hand down. Right? This is a cultural problem. And again, I'm going to the roots of that cultural problem too. One example, which I still find quite shocking, of research misconduct. Now, you want to understand, this isn't all about money. For academics, there is a pressure to publish, there is a power and prestige that comes with publications. And one of the most egregious examples was a Dutch researcher was fired in Holland from his job for committing fraud. He basically published lots of papers on the use of beta blocker drugs in non-cardiac surgery that influenced European Society Cardiology guidelines. And it's estimated that his fraud was responsible for 800,000 excess deaths across Europe. That's one person in one situation where this was determined. So again, I do public advocacy, I do private advocacy, and again in my role over the years, initially campaigning on obesity, I was inspired by the work of the BMJ's Too Much Medicine campaign, started in 2012. JAMA Internal Medicine in the US also started a campaign called Less is More, and understanding that we have a big problem of over-medicated society. One figure suggests that the third most common cause of death globally after heart disease and cancer is prescribed medications, what your doctor prescribes for you because of side effects, and these are mostly preventable. So this is a big, big issue. This is a public health problem, even before the COVID pandemic. And I worked with the medical Royal Colleges in the UK, and it didn't take long to convince the leaders of the medical Royal Colleges that they should start a campaign. I then coordinated this with the BMJ, and I was the lead author in this paper called Choosing Wisely in order to wind back the harms of too much medicine. And of course, with all this waste as well, it's an ethical duty on doctors in a healthcare system with limited resources. One doctor's waste, as in doing treatments that are essentially useless or marginally beneficial, is another patient's delay. And of course, this has a big impact on the healthcare system. Okay, this is one of the most crucial slides of my talk, just to give you some perspective of this issue about misleading health statistics. I'm a numbers person, so just bear with me on this. Again, it's not rocket science. One of the previous speakers talked about, I think Amitabh was talking about the fact that maths, basic science maths actually is the way forward through this. This is stuff that, people in high school, teenagers, will be able to understand, right? So misleading health statistics, let's talk about that. So there are many ways of presenting a benefit of a treatment. You can use something called relative risk or absolute risk, something known as the numbers needed to treat. If you communicate relative risk as opposed to absolute risks, it can lead lay people and doctors, by the way, to overestimate the benefit of a medical intervention. So if we take, for example, randomized controlled trials on the use of statins, many people here might be familiar with cholesterol-lowering statins. It's very well prescribed in India. Okay? So if you look at type 2 diabetics and you look at the benefit of statins in that group, and you treat them for 4 years, there is a 48% relative risk reduction in them having a stroke. Sounds quite impressive, doesn't it? Patient comes in, take the statin, you're 48% less likely to have a stroke. Sounds very impressive. What does it actually mean if you look at the information where that comes from? It reduces the risk of having a stroke from 28 in 1,000, so 1,000 people followed up on the placebo over 4 years, 28 of them had a stroke out of 1,000, to 15 in 1,000 in the people that took the statin. So of the 1,000 people that took the statin, only 15 people had a stroke versus 28. So you reduce the number by 13 in 1,000, right? So 13 over 28 times 100 is a 48% relative risk reduction, yes? But what it actually means for the individual is an absolute risk reduction of 1.3%, 13 over 1,000. Yeah, do you follow me? Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's a 1.3 benefit, but another way of presenting that data, which is something we wrote about in the Choosing Wisely paper, and this is something that I call, when the information is available, you should use this, is that you need to treat 77 people to prevent 1 stroke. So what I tell my patients in this situation about informed consent, I will say to them, if you take the statin religiously, and by the way, the caveat here is this comes from industry-sponsored data, and if you don't get side effects, and if we believe it to be absolutely true, yes, these are important points to mention, right, in the conversation. There is a 1 in 77 chance it will prevent you having a stroke. Now, the patients may have differing opinions on that. They may say, well, I'm very worried about stroke, family history, I'll take the chance, doc. Others will say, you know what, I don't think that's the best option for me. Is there anything else I can do? And of course, we can talk about lifestyle there. Mismatch framing in medical journals compounds the issue. So if you look at a sample of medical journal articles between 2006 and 2004 and 2006, there was a sample that was chosen in Lancet, BMJ, and JAMA. A third of those articles use mismatch framing. In other words, when these trials were reported in the journal, the benefits were presented as relative risk and the harms as absolute risk. I mean, this is just ridiculous. It's absolutely shocking, right? Surprise, surprise, obviously all of those articles were publications designed and sponsored by pharma. Yeah, this is marketing. This is not science. This is not medical truth. This is not transparent communication. This is not informed consent. This is marketing. Now, don't just take my word for it. We talk about the WHO, and I think they do a lot of good things, and we're going to talk about WHO and their problems shortly. But Gerd Gigerenzer, who I met, he was... at the time, he was considered the world-leading researcher on health and statistical literacy in the Max Planck Institute, where Einstein was also a student and teacher. And he said in a WHO Bulletin 2009, you can look this up, it's free online. It is an ethical imperative that every doctor and patient understand the difference between absolute and relative risks to protect patients against unnecessary anxiety and manipulation. In other words, I could say, in my opinion, if that information is available, it is unethical for doctors just to give the presentation to the patient in relative risks and not absolute risk terms. And when you look at the evidence about, okay, when we look at literature on when data is presented in this way, does it have a negative impact? No, it doesn't. In fact, outcomes are no worse, and actually you end up saving more money. And I wrote this editorial with the chair of the medical college at the time, that then made front page headline news in the UK, where I talked about a patient, which is quite extraordinary. One of my most interesting patients is a heart attack patient, former pilot, had a stent, very bright guy. He was a maths and physics teacher. He could no longer fly planes. He was a international pilot with Virgin Atlantic, and he had to go back to teaching maths and physics. And he was put on a cocktail of medications, aspirin, statins, everything. And he got side effects. And he looked at the benefits, and he thought they were quite small. And he said, I'm going to change my lifestyle. He went on a low carbohydrate diet. And I'm still in touch with him. And he's doing amazing. He's actually breaking his own records on ultramarathons now, right? He's off all his meds. Now, I'm not saying this is for everybody, but this is what can be achieved. And this is, again, in keeping with his preferences and values. I said to him, actually, I think you should go on aspirin. I think you should take a low-dose statin. He had a heart attack. But he decided for himself he didn't want to do that, and I supported his decision. And this is what, he's got amazing parameters now in terms of his health, and he's doing really well. Okay, let's move on. We're getting on to so just briefly as well, I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but at the very beginning of the pandemic, like many of you here, I was able to look at the data coming from China and Italy, and we knew, obviously age was a risk factor, but there was a huge prevalence of increased risk of COVID in relation to obesity. And it's specifically metabolic syndrome, which I will describe shortly. And I wrote this article in European Scientist. I was getting quite frustrated. I went on Sky News in March 2020, right at the beginning, and I said, listen, we've got this very clear evidence of metabolic syndrome and obesity being linked to COVID outcomes. We need a public health education campaign repeatedly to tell people this is the time to change their diets. Because we know dietary changes rapidly improve risk factors for heart disease. This is what I did, this is what I published on. Within 3 weeks, you start to see reversal of metabolic syndrome in some studies in 50% of people. Absolute numbers, right? Why was this not told to the public? And I published this paper in, we knew, for example, in the UK, that there seemed to be a doubling of risk of worse COVID outcomes amongst people from Indian and South Asian backgrounds. So I published this article in the journal Physician, and we highlighted the fact, it's very difficult for you to read there, but essentially there are, and this is very easy and cheap for people to measure, but there are these metabolic factors, which include your cholesterol profile, triglycerides and HDL, waist circumference, blood pressure, and whether you're pre-diabetic or diabetic. Those are the most important factors when you look at risk from lifestyle and vitamin D deficiency as well of COVID-19. And the point here is the only intervention that really has an impact on this rapidly is lifestyle. In fact, you can reverse these metabolic syndrome or improve them within, again, just through dietary changes. And just coming back, I know we've mentioned it earlier, just give some people some perspective here. We had a doubling of risk of COVID-19 from obesity, but if you have metabolic syndrome, it's 4 to 5 fold increased risk. And why that's important in India is because India don't have an obesity problem as much as we have in the UK and the US, but we have a big problem with metabolic syndrome because Indians at lower levels of body fat have the same metabolic problems that people with obesity get, right? So we need to look at the metabolic risk factors, and one of the things that you can do, anybody can do, is a very simple test, right, which will give you a good, crude idea about whether you've got metabolic syndrome or you're heading there, is your waist circumference and looking at your height. So you want your waist circumference to be less than half your height. So say, for example, you're 170 centimeters in terms of your height, you want your waist circumference to be less than 85. Yeah? 85 times 2 is 170. Yeah? So that's what you want. And if you are there, then you're likely going to be in a better position. And again, this is very straightforward, very easy, very cheap test. A tape measure, anybody can use. And again, just coming back to this on a broader level, because I've been involved in this for many years, looking at the prevention and potential reversal of heart disease. Again, it comes back to something called insulin resistance. And again, this is driven by high glycemic index carbohydrate diets, for example, being sedentary, having very high stress levels. All of these play in to creating this, which are really the root cause of heart disease. And if you address these factors, you can at the very least stabilize your coronary disease and even potentially reverse it, certainly when you add in meditation. And this is just a figure from an article I published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. My co-authors were actually editors of two medical, both cardiologists, John Internal Medicine and BMJ Open Heart. And it was titled, "It's time to, saturated fat doesn't clog the arteries," but actually coronary artery disease is a chronic inflammatory condition which can be effectively managed with lifestyle changes. That's really where the future is. And this, of course, all plays into the COVID pandemic as well, because we had a fast pandemic that exploited a slow pandemic of chronic disease driven by lifestyle factors. So eventually I managed to get this on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. This article was featured there, and then suddenly hit the mainstream news. And this was in the summer of 2020. And I said again, no one was talking about the risk of people dying from obesity-related illness from COVID, and the ultra-processed food, which is a big problem in the US and the UK. I mean, just to give you an example, 60% of the calorie consumption in the US and 50% of the calorie consumption in the UK in the population comes from ultra-processed food. What does that mean? If it comes from a packet and it has 5 or more ingredients, usually with unhealthy oils, sugar, for example, additives and preservatives, it's ultra-processed, don't eat it. That's effectively what it means, right? So that is really, and we know that it links to chronic inflammation, etc., etc. And then I was I was asked to go on BBC News then and Good Morning Britain. I've done a lot of work over the years and as an activist, so those platforms are quite influential and powerful. And I'd also written in the article that our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and I knew Boris through my work as I was an advisor for the London Food Board when he was Mayor of London, and I worked with one of the senior people that said to me one day, "Aseem, I'm really worried about Boris." I said, this is before the pandemic. I said, well, he said, he's very overweight. He's cycling around London, but, he's eating junk food, right? And you need to have a word with him, right? And when Boris got admitted, I knew that was probably a factor, and I suggested that in the article, and it was on the news, and then my comments then hit the Times, right, newspaper, and then I was contacted by the Secretary of State for Health at the time, Matt Hancock, to advise him, what should we be doing on obesity? And I said, listen, we've seen this before, right? Big tobacco, for about 50 years from when the first links between smoking and lung cancer were published, the links between, adopted a dirty playbooks corporate strategy, which we're going to come on to with pharma shortly, where they denied that smoking was causing lung cancer, planted doubt, confused the public, and even the worst part, certainly as a doctor, they bought the loyalty of conflicted, or dare I use the word, bent scientists. And when the link between smoking and heart attacks came out, scientists that were funded by Big Tobacco started publishing articles saying that it wasn't the cigarettes, it was stress. People who were smoking are stressed, and that's the cause. So there's a history here, there's a precedent here. And I said to Matt Hancock, I said, listen, we tackled cigarettes by raising the taxes, making it more expensive, banning tobacco advertising, and then a public health education campaign. And that's what you need to do with ultra-processed food. Of course, the rhetoric is there. They haven't really implemented these problems. They'll say, yes, this is what we should do, but they haven't introduced the policies yet. And of course, now we know 90% of the COVID deaths worldwide happened in countries where more than 50% of the population were overweight or obese. So really that has proven to be true. Okay, let's go through my vaccine journey quickly, okay? So, first and foremost, I'm still very much a supporter of traditional vaccinations. We know, for example, smallpox, which had a mortality rate of 30%, was effectively eradicated after vaccination was introduced. Of course, it took this is something that I became more familiar with later on, 5 to 10 years of safety checks, for example. But we were able, and it's estimated that 4 to 5 billion lives a year globally are saved because of traditional vaccines. Vaccines are holy grail in medicine, right? In a way, for me, certainly going back to the beginning of 2021, if you say vaccine, next to vaccine, the definition probably should just be safe and effective, right? I'm an advocate for, highlighting the manipulations of pharma, but I never once believed at all that a vaccine could do any damage, and certainly no damage to the heart. So that's where I was. That was my mindset at the beginning of 2021. My father, who was a deputy, the vice president of the BMA in his 70s, general practitioner, again, he graduated from Indian medical colleges here. All your Indian doctors, how important traditional vaccines have been, right? In saving millions of lives in India, no doubt. and still a big issue, okay? There's no doubt about that. Let's establish that, first and foremost. That doesn't mean that they're completely safe. No drug is completely safe, right? But their effects have been very, very extensive. I went on Good Morning Britain. On the left slide there, you'll see a film director you may know of, Gurinder Chadha. I also spent a lot of time, you won't mind me sharing this with you, during lockdown, going for walks. I spent a lot of time with Shekhar Kapoor, okay, the film director. I know Shekhar very well. And again, both Gurinder and Shekhar, I convinced, I didn't push them, but they're asking me about the vaccine, etc. So listen, I'm not sure about the efficacy. We know vaccines against coronaviruses are not traditionally very good, but I couldn't conceive of a harm, and of course, let's just get it done. So I went on Good Morning Britain because Gurinder said she had the vaccine because of me, and I didn't demonize unvaccinated people or anything like that. I said, listen, there are rational concerns for people not wanting to have the vaccine, and there are irrational concerns. And I said irrational concerns like microchips part of the vaccine. I know my friend over here may disagree with me, but I didn't think at the time that this was part of any deliberate strategy. I'll come on to rational reasons for that later. I know you want to hear this. I don't think there's a depopulation agenda or whatever, right? But I said that, the rational concerns are genuine. Look at what pharma have done over the last 2 decades, right? The fraud they've committed, I understand it, but I said, when you look at traditional vaccines, they're one of the safest of all the pharmacological interventions we have in medicine. They're still the safest, and that's how I left it. And then, of course, things changed. July 2021, my father sadly suffered a sudden cardiac death in a very unusual circumstances. He was a very fit guy. Amongst his Indian community friends, we don't have a family history of heart disease. He was super fit. He had a mild angina-type pain, and within 30 minutes, he had a sudden cardiac death. I didn't understand what was going on. His post-mortem findings didn't make sense, and he had critical coronary stenosis. And then a few months later, and at that time, I didn't think the vaccine was implicated. And a few months later, different data started to emerge. First of all, plausible mechanism published in Circulation of how the vaccine, mRNA vaccine, accelerates heart disease. So straight away, I'm thinking, okay, this might explain my dad's issue. Then we have data coming in the UK of increased heart attacks. And then I got contacted by a researcher, a very prestigious institution, a cardiologist I know, very high integrity, who was very upset. And I said, what's wrong? He said, Aseem, a group of researchers have accidentally found, through use of coronary imaging, that the mRNA vaccine is increasing inflammation of the heart arteries. But they had a meeting and they said, we're not going to publish these findings because it may affect our funding from pharma. Okay? And he was very upset, and I said, okay, well, listen, let me draw the attention to this. So I went on GB News in the UK. I told them this is what I'm going to talk about. This went viral. Behind the scenes, I know Peter's gone through this more than anybody, right? The attacks happened behind the scenes. One prestigious medical institution, which I won't name now, that story will come out later. I was having to battle now. I'm suddenly an anti-vaxxer. Doctors are making complaints against me. All I said was, let's investigate this. Let's look at it. That's all I said. And I had to deal with all of that behind the scenes, right? So then I thought to myself, listen, I can't just be going on Twitter and on TV, right, to start talking about what I think. I need to really and I know Peter was making noise about this well before I came in. And I was listening to Peter and I thought, okay, let me spend some time critically appraising the data myself and breaking it down in the way that people can understand what are the benefits of the vaccine and what are the harms on the best available evidence. And that's what I did. I spent 9 months doing that before I published. So that was just the start of my journey. So let's just give you some of the summary findings here. So I went back and looked at the randomized controlled trials. Peter is exactly correct, right? The original trials on the Pfizer vaccine, and by the way, I know COVID Shield is a big issue and topic here. We'll come on to COVID Shield, don't worry, right? On the Pfizer vaccine, if you look at the original randomized controlled trials, there was no reduction in COVID mortality, right? It didn't reduce COVID mortality. It didn't reduce all-cause mortality. There was a 95% relative risk reduction in infection. But when you look at it, it actually meant that you had to vaccinate 119 people to prevent one infection from the original Wuhan strain. And that's if you believe Pfizer. Right? That's if you believe Pfizer. Now, what else is interesting in this analysis, just so you know, about COVID Shield? So Joseph Freeman did this analysis. Okay, he's a very eminent researcher. And he says that the 1 in 119 figure you can apply effectively to all the other COVID vaccines. Moderna, J&J, COVID Shield. Right, so remember this figure. Okay? 1 in 119 prevented from infection. Now, if there are no harms, and if that was consistent, fine. Vaccinate billions of people and you'll save millions of lives, right? But that obviously wasn't true. What else was told to the public? If you have antibodies, and I thought that antibodies, like with other vaccines, gives you protection. The FDA themselves, it wasn't publicized in the news, but they put it on their website. they say explicitly in May 2021, basically, the public and healthcare providers, the results from currently authorized SARS-CoV-2 antibody tests should not be used to evaluate a person's level of immunity or protection from COVID-19 at any time, and especially after the person has received COVID-19 vaccination. So antibody testing in the blood does not give you any reliable information on prevention of infection or severity, right? I then started to look at data in the UK. Can we give you a rough estimate of benefit of the vaccine? Okay? Can you give me an estimate in terms of preventing deaths? Now, I had limited information at the time, and the information has evolved. So we looked at 100,000 people vaccinated versus unvaccinated of the Delta variant. So this is the interesting bit. I know it's quite small, so I'll just break it down for you. And by the way, this has evolved. And I said at the time when I published this in the paper, this is likely an exaggeration. But at the moment, this is the information we have last year. You had to vaccinate 230 people over the age of 70 to prevent one COVID death. 520 if you're 70 to 80. And then once you get under 70, you have to then vaccinate tens of thousands of people to prevent one COVID death. All right, remember that figure. Now, it's evolved. We've got better data. This is new. I've not given this in any talk before. Only last week, our UK government released data per million people vaccinated versus unvaccinated on prevention of hospitalization, not death, okay? Prevention of hospitalization, severe hospitalization from COVID from the vaccines. Are you ready? This is a benefit for individuals. If you're over 70, you have to vaccinate from 2 doses of Pfizer, 7,500 people to prevent one severe hospitalization with COVID. 5,700 if you're 60 to 70. If you're 50 to 60, 18,700. And as soon as you get younger than that, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. And by the way, this is still on non-randomized data. So it could be an exaggeration. There are all so many factors that are played in there. It could be natural immunity, whatever, right? But this gives you some good idea now from real-world data of the benefits of the vaccine. It is very, 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 very poor. It is very, 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 very poor. Okay? And remember, the COVID Shield vaccine is likely to be similar. Let me just fast forward a little bit, because I know we're a bit short of time. I don't want to overdo it. So let's look at how, and I'm going to come on to the harms shortly. What about the media, right? The media have had a massive role to play in influencing doctors, members of the public, and even policymakers, right? And the media, if you look at how accurate are the media in reporting healthcare stories, and this was a publication in JAMA a few years ago, and it showed that in almost all media stories, most of them did not fulfill criteria for accurate reporting of the results of the trials they're reporting on. Now, let me give you this example. Now, some of you may be hearing, and I'm sure I've heard this. I had a debate which was hosted by Bharkat Dutt, that some of you may have seen a few months ago, right? And I was put up against a number of people who were arguing against me in India about how the vaccine has saved so many lives and how COVID is causing heart attacks, etc. This was a headline in the Times newspaper 3 months ago. I was sent this by a doctor who's on site, and he said, Aseem, are you sure the vaccine's a problem? Are you sure it's not COVID? This was a headline. Even mild COVID linked to heart disease and strokes. Okay? Is this true? Do we think that it could be true? But is it true? So I went to look at the original research on which this headline was based, published in BMJ Heart. Okay? And the conclusions are these. Individuals hospitalized with COVID-19 have increased risk of cardiovascular events. So these people are hospitalized during the original Wuhan strain, by the way. And we know if you had obesity or heart disease, you're more likely to have problems, right? But this was not there in people who were not hospitalized with mild COVID. But what's really interesting is they found something else. People with mild COVID, they couldn't explain the findings. People with mild COVID had a lower risk of having a heart attack. So what's going on with the Times headlines there? This is pure propaganda. Pure propaganda. Now, I want to play devil's advocate here. Why should you listen to Aseem Malhotra or Peter McCullough? What about the regulators? That's what their job is, right? They're supposed to regulate, look at the data rigorously. Can we trust the regulators? No, we can't. I want to trust the regulators. I want them to be doing their job properly so when people like me and Peter can't spend so much of our time in this space, right? Energies, time, everything. You know, we want to be able to trust our authoritative figures so that we can have better population health, but unfortunately we can't, because this investigation in the BMJ showed most of the major regulators in Western countries around the world were being funded by pharma. 65% of the funding of the FDA, 86% of the funding of the MHRA are being funded by pharma. Now, Donald Light, who was a sociologist, who's looked at this for a long time, a researcher in this area, he was quoted in the BMJ, and I think this is the most perfect way of describing the situation. Can we trust the regulators? It is the opposite of having a trustworthy organization independently and rigorously assessing medicines. They're not rigorous, they're not independent, they are selective and they withhold data. Doctors and patients must appreciate how deeply and extensively drug regulators cannot be trusted so long as they are captured by industry funding. Okay, let's talk about the harms. Let's try and break it down. Best available evidence. Now, Joseph Freeman, Peter Doshi, associate at the BMJ, Robert Kaplan from Stanford, they were able to go back with new data and reanalyze Moderna and Pfizer's original trials. These are the trials that led to the approval of the vaccine. What did they find in terms of absolute harms? 1 in 800 serious adverse events. Well, this is more interesting. The original trials during the ancestral strain of the virus, they found in those trials, you were more likely to suffer a serious adverse event from the vaccine than you were to be hospitalized with COVID. What does that mean? In my view, that suggests these vaccines should never have been approved for anyone in the beginning. And this is even more, I just found more explicable and shocking. The World Health Organization, when the vaccines were being approved, they endorsed a list, this is in my paper, they endorsed a list of what could go wrong with these vaccines in terms of side effects. Right? Anything and everything that can go wrong with the heart is on that list. From cardiac arrest, heart attacks, myocarditis, pericarditis, angina, supraventricular arrhythmias. It's all on that list. Why were doctors not given this list? Doctors around the world who are willfully blind to these harms, to vaccine injuries. In medicine, if you're not, even if a rare, I remember in medical school, we are taught to learn about some of the rarest conditions that we may never see. But the reason we learn about this is if we're not aware of the cluster of symptoms that give you the diagnosis, you'll always miss it. Even if this was rare, give that to the doctors to see. So they're aware of this potential harm. They were not given this list. It's extraordinary. And they based this list upon the animal studies, the vaccine platform that was being used, harms from other vaccines, and even COVID itself. A lot of the complications we see from vaccine injuries are the complications you see in people with severe COVID. Okay? That's what's happening there. Now, this is really interesting. One of the things I always teach my medical students, the best doctors are the ones that listen to the patient. 80% of your diagnosis comes from the history. This is the basics of medical teaching. Listen to your patient. If you do the history properly, you'll get the diagnosis most of the time. Now, this is not a high-quality, level randomized controlled trial, but this is very interesting. Even though we were sold in 2021 that this was safe and effective, repeatedly indoctrinated, this survey, published in BMC Infectious Diseases recently, suggested, according to surveys of who people knew that they thought they were vaccine injured or there was a death because of the vaccine, they estimated in the United States in 2021 there may have been 278,000 fatalities because of the vaccine and 1 million serious adverse events. So I've summarized that, saying that the serious adverse events could be as high as 1 in 300. Serious adverse event means hospitalization, disability, life-changing event, okay? And the death rate could be close to 1 in 1,000. This is essentially, in some ways, replicating what some of those trials have shown already. And of course, Peter's more of an expert on this than I am, but what's the mechanism of harm? The spike protein from the mRNA vaccines that we thought would stay in the arm, and just generate antibodies and that's it, seems, and we've got good evidence for that now, gets distributed with the lipid nanoparticles throughout the body in every organ system, the brain, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, the ovaries, the testes, and can be there for up to 4 months, if maybe not longer. And what it likely does, it either has a direct toxic effect on those tissues or causes an autoimmune reaction. So we have plausible biological mechanism as well. And then what about observational data? Retzef Levy, who I know, one of the authors on this paper, in Israel, they looked at, because you might be hearing, hold on a minute, Dr. Malhotra, isn't COVID behind the heart attacks, etc., etc.? So what they did is, they did analysis in Israel, an observational study, where they found there was a 25% increase, in heart attacks and sudden cardiac death in people aged between 16 and 39, which was associated with the vaccine but not associated with COVID. We're talking about mRNA again. And of course, we've got this. Okay, what about COVID Shield? Now, we've managed to hit the headlines today. We certainly hit the news today. And you can look that up if you Google. Amitav is quoted in Zara as well about COVID Shield. Now, I was shocked. I was so focused on the Pfizer data and mRNA, it didn't. Now, if I wasn't aware of it, I don't know how many other people were, right? I know some people in India were. I did not know COVID Shield was AstraZeneca until about a month ago, until Bharaka interviewed me. I did not know that COVID Shield was AstraZeneca. We've suspended AstraZeneca, essentially the COVID Shield vaccine in all European countries. It was suspended in some as early as March, April 2021. Why? Because it was causing serious adverse effects, blood clots, heart attacks, and strokes. Okay? And, one of the high-profile people was a BBC presenter. I've had message exchanges with her husband. I'm just so sorry for this. Lisa Shaw, 44-year-old, and a coroner confirmed that she died because of the AstraZeneca vaccine, Covishield, right? But this is the thing. I've just told you, unequivocally in my view, the Pfizer vaccine should never have been approved, and the serious adverse events are unprecedented. By June 2021, we had peer-reviewed research suggesting that Covishield was worse than Pfizer. What did India do? Why did you do it? Who is responsible here? Honestly, you need to ask these questions. I know the Indian government did not give immunity to Pfizer and AstraZeneca, I learned, and all the vaccine manufacturers against damages if vaccine injuries occur. Now, interestingly, Pfizer backed off, and we know why. Pfizer said, okay, we're not going to use your vaccine in India. But AstraZeneca carried on. We need to find out, but we need to understand what happened in India. Why were government authorities, medical associations, what were they doing? Did they think that their analysis of AstraZeneca's harms was better than all of the European countries who decided it was so bad that it needed to be suspended? Maybe that's true, but it's not likely, is it? Something else is going on here. Something else is going on, and I will tell you 3 words that will probably give you the answer. Follow the money. Yes. Okay, so let's summarize the key facts. We're getting towards the end, but I'm also going to take you to the root of the root causes. Okay, so the key summary facts are these, right? Obviously, the vaccine is offering no protection now. The initial protection, if it was true against the initial variant, was 1 in 119 for infection. There's no reduction in all-cause mortality from the randomized control trials. The serious adverse event rate is at least 1 in 800. Of course, we know natural immunity is very protective. We know the hospitalization prevention is very poor. We have these yellow card schemes in the UK, VARS in America, in terms of the reports of. And by the way, with COVID Shield, just so you know, with the AstraZeneca vaccine in the UK, we stopped using it when there were 800,000 yellow card reports of these people reporting on adverse effects that were beyond mild. 800,000 after 9.7 million doses. That is unprecedented, right? So in India, I'm sure this has probably caused a pretty much horrific effect. I have no doubt on Indian population. And I know you have lots of anecdotal cases going on here with this. Okay, so let's go to the root of the root problem here. There's something I think, a really nice definition you need to be aware of, because it explains a lot of the problems in the world today when we talk about mental and physical well-being. It's called the commercial determinants of health. Strategies and approaches adopted by the private sector to promote products and choices that are detrimental or harmful to your health. This applies to big food, it applies to big pharma. Again, it'd be difficult for you to see this, but I'm just going to summarize it for you. So there is a framework that's published. How do big corporations exert their power that influence health policy? It's really important because health policy downstream has effect on clinical decision making in the consultation room with doctor and patients, but it affects public health. It affects whether it's mandates or what kind of food you're being sold and marketing, etc., etc. Ultimately, affects our mental and physical health downstream. So how do they exert their power? Well, they exert their power by having influence on the vehicles of the political environment. So lobbying. In America, campaign donations, for example, the influence of politicians, right? Politicians often, I know many politicians on both sides of the fence in the UK, even some politicians here that I won't name. But a lot of them are actually ignorant of the situation. They're being lobbied by pharma. They get told that the information they're being given is the complete truth. They don't hear the other side. So to give them the benefit of the doubt, of course there are commercial conflicts of interest. They are also indoctrinated. Remember that. Let's remember they are also indoctrinated. Which means there is hope for us to get through to them if they hear the truth communicated in the right way. Then you have preference shaping, so capture of the media. Philanthropic organizations. Okay, who am I going to name here? The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now this is a big problem, right? So Bill Gates is heavily invested stocks in McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and the pharmaceutical industry, right? These are companies that I describe as probably the biggest enemies of democracy today. Yeah? And Bill Gates is the second largest contributor to the WHO. So when we try and understand why the WHO are not independent, we want them to be, they are heavily conflicted. In my own journey on sugar, I'll just tell you briefly, when I was investigating the harms of sugar and what happened with the WHO, a lot of people are more aware of the harms of sugar now, right? And we've got policies in the UK to tackle sugar consumption. But it could have happened 10 years earlier, and the reason it didn't is the World Health Organization in 2003, having looked at the data, were about to publish and say that we need to massively reduce our consumption of sugar worldwide. Guess what happened? They didn't do that. Do you know why? The American government under George Bush threatened to withdraw funding from the WHO because they were lobbied by Coca-Cola if they changed their sugar guidelines. Right? You can look this up. There's a Guardian article about it. So I knew for a long time the WHO were compromised, right? Second biggest funder to the WHO is Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Margaret Chan, the former director of the WHO, in a recent interview said 70% of their funding comes with strings attached. So remember this, right? Commercial entities are controlling the narrative here. They're controlling everything. Knowledge and education. They fund medical research, drug industry-sponsored studies, universities, academics, for example. The legal environment, they're protected to indemnification. If they commit fraud, we talked earlier, Peter Gosha, none of the people who are involved in committing the fraud lost their jobs or got, they have legal. So ultimately, if we're going to break through this, it has to be changes in the law. Nothing that's happened throughout history that's been meaningful has really happened without changes in the law, right? Ultimately. And we can even trace this back to the emancipation of India from British colonial rule, right? This is what it takes. We need to change the law here. And then we talk about extra-legal environment. Now, me and Peter, this is opposition fragmentation. So public health campaigners and activists that call out and speak the truth, and sorry, pardon my language here, call out the bullshit of these corporations. We get attacked, we get smeared, right? I'm sure many of you here have had it. Johan has had it, I know. This is what we need to understand. This is all part of their corporate playbook to basically keep the truth from the people. And as Noam Chomsky, the economist and philosopher, says, the general population and doctors don't know what's happening, and they don't even know that they don't know. So really, corporate power needs to be a public health priority. That's the root of the issue. Our economic system is doing far more damage to mental and physical health and public health than any single product. You need to understand that, right? Okay, let me just give you one brief example of how bad this issue of fraud is. So, some of you may be aware of the Vioxx scandal. This is a drug that was produced by the drug company Merck. And in 2011, Merck were fined $950 million, okay, because it was found that they withheld data on the fact that this was causing cardiovascular harm. It was estimated that Vioxx killed ultimately 60,000 Americans. And Merck knew, right? As in, when the drug was being rolled out, they had that data and they withheld it. And John Abramson here, who spoke to Joe Rogan, John Abramson's a Harvard doctor, and did a lot of work on this and was involved in the litigation process. He said internal emails found when Merck were marketing and producing their drug, one of the chief scientists of Merck, in an internal email, said, it is unfortunate about the cardiovascular side effects of this drug, but we will do well and the drug will do well. Right? What do you call that kind of behavior? How would you describe that kind of behavior?
Evil.
Okay, you think murder, evil, okay, fine. So I'm going to give you a rational explanation, okay? So Robert Hare is a forensic psychologist and behind the original definition of the word, international definition of psychopath. And in the book The Corporation, in the documentary in the early 2000s, he actually says quite often, multinational corporations, and he talks about pharma here, he said they fulfill the criteria as an entity, not the people within them, as a legal entity, they fulfill the criteria for psychopathy. Right? What does that mean? It means callous unconcern for the feelings in others, deceit, lying, conning others for profit. They fulfill all those criteria. So I've come up with this term, if you look at the root of the problem, it isn't just the commercial determinants of health, I call it the psychopathic determinants of health. Because people say to me, Aseem, with all this data, what's going on right now? This is crazy. They use this word, it's crazy. Yes, the root of the problem is a psychopathic determinant. One of the root causes. We need to understand it at its root, and therefore changing the legal environment around that will protect people in the future. Now, Anthony Fauci kept going on the television, trust the science, he said. Trust the science. Well, first of all, as a medical doctor, that is one of the most unscientific statements I've ever heard. Right? Medicine has never been an exact science like physics or chemistry. It is an applied science. It is a social science. It's a constantly evolving science. It's a science of human beings. Right? But when Fauci said this, I know he probably didn't mean it this way, but in effect what he was telling everybody, and this is where the problem has arisen, he was saying trust the psychopath. And we know that has turned out to be a very, very bad idea. Social media platforms, we've been trying to get our information out on social media, and that has been been difficult. I've done most of my work in campaigning on platforms through mainstream media as an activist. I found it very difficult, even with the obesity stuff. It took me a long time to highlight that link again on mainstream media. And even social media, I was getting banned on social media, suspended. I started questioning whether masks are useful for kids, and I was suspended for several days. This has been a constant issue for me in the last couple of years. And then I found out that Facebook has partnered with Merck to control health information on their platform. Right? And I went on GB News and I said, I'm sorry, but as far as I'm concerned at the moment, I said Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg is an enemy of democracy as well. And like many here, I've suffered personally from these failings in the healthcare system, these commercial influences. My poor mom, this was featured on the front page a few years ago, she died in hospital. She went into heart failure because the system was under so much pressure. They couldn't treat her in time. She was in pulmonary edema. A lot of her health issues were triggered by addiction to ultra-processed food. She was overweight. She had rheumatoid arthritis. And she had a horrible, horrible death. My father, again, before I understood about the issue about the vaccine, there was a 30-minute delay in the ambulance getting to him, even though his cardiac arrest was witnessed by 2 doctors, Indian doctors, who did CPR on him. And I wrote about this, and in fact, just to tell you the cultural problem here, I was the first to expose the ambulance delay issue in the UK, which is constantly on BBC News now. Now I got it onto BBC News. And before I published it, I knew that there was a cover-up, and I got this information from someone, a whistleblower in the Department of Health, saying that Aseem, for several weeks before your dad died, the government and Department of Health knew that there were ambulance delays for heart attacks. Now in the UK we've got very high standards for this. Normally they should come in 8 minutes. I published on this and I've been involved in this area for a while. And she was crying. She was a nurse, a very senior nurse. And I said, okay, well I'm going to publish this and write about this. So I texted, and this is one of the good guys, right? So I'm not going to name him. He's one of the good guys, but just to tell you the cultural problem. I texted one of the leading, most eminent published academic cardiologists in the world, and certainly in the UK, who I knew. And I said to him, Prof, I just want to let you know I found this out about the ambulance delays, because of course this affects our patients, right? I said, I'm going to publish this. And his reply to me was, Aseem, I wouldn't do that if I were you. You're only going to make yourself more enemies. Okay? You're only going to make yourself enemies. Now, this, again, I would describe as a cultural phenomenon, as a downstream effect of the psychopathic determinants of health. What has happened when our senior leaders, even the good guys, are afraid to speak out? We have to create a safe environment for people to speak as well. But listen, let's not get this wrong. Peter knows this. It is not safe to speak the truth. Let's establish that. It is not safe to speak the truth. But it is even less safe to not speak the truth. Because even if we're protecting ourselves from some short-term harm, the longer-term harms will get bigger and bigger, and suddenly we've got this mammoth task, we've got a tsunami that we're up against, okay? This big psychopathic juggernaut right now that we're having to fight from every angle. So how do we change policy? I want to empower people here moving forward. What do we do? What are the rules that I've used, for example, when it's combating sugar or changing the paradigm on heart disease? So this is a lovely framework that was developed, structure developed in Thailand called the triangle that moves the mountain. So whenever you do your advocacy, when you're working together as a team and supporting people like Ashutosh and Johan and Amitabh, think about the triangle that moves the mountain. Let's get the knowledge correct. Let's get it independent of vested interest. Let's get it clear and concrete in a way that the public can understand. Then it's about disseminating that knowledge through social participation in a social movement which is gathering here. And that can happen through mainstream or social media. But it has to simultaneously influence the politicians. The politicians listen to the electorate, right? The electorate influenced by the media, right? So this is how we spread the truth. This is a framework that we can use. But it's not easy. It is not easy. Simon Chapman, who is considered the leading advocate for tobacco control in Australia, he wrote this paper about his 10 lessons for people involved in public health advocacy when he took on the big tobacco, right? And he basically says, there's one thing that's really important to explain to our colleagues as well. He says, careers are often built on a lifetime commitment to a particular phase of evidence, but if the evidence changes, it is absolutely critical for public trust in the integrity of public health that we acknowledge the facts have changed, and accordingly we have changed our minds too. Patients and public are very forgiving. If there's a doctor, you say, listen, the information has changed. I said this at the time. It turns out to be wrong. This is the new information. Patients want to trust their doctors. But if you stay in denial, that trust erodes. And eventually becomes very, very difficult to get it back if you are suppressing the truth as a doctor. It's really important. So media attention on a public health issue is more effective than private advocacy in winning policy change. You know why? Because sunlight is a very potent disinfectant for malodorous health policy. Right? You remember that. Sunlight is very powerful disinfectant. But we must be evidence-based. We must be evidence-based, we must be clear, and we must be concise. Okay? And then I'll move on. And this is the one here where, this is something that's ongoing at the moment. You have to grow a rhinoceros side, you have to have a thick skin and be patient. Because as soon as your work threatens, unless you're an advocate for an uncontroversial policy, as soon as your work threatens an industry or an ideological cabal, you will be attacked, sometimes relentlessly and viciously. Unrelentingly and viciously. So you have to remember that. And, more recently, I went on BBC News. I was accused of hijacking the BBC. I was asked to talk about statins, and I slowly wove into the conversation that there was an issue about excess deaths probably linked to the vaccine. And then The Guardian, by the way, who I've written 19 opinion editorials for, so it doesn't matter, there's no loyalty here, they said BBC criticised for letting cardiologists hijack interview with false COVID jab claim. I had influenced a politician in Parliament who got up and said we need to suspend the vaccine, who was then attacked. And I was accused of being part of a gang of grooming anti-vaxxers. Okay? So this is the kind of thing. But listen, I was expecting this. This is progress, right? When I published my paper, I was going to let go of the outcome. When you speak the truth, let go of the outcome. And I knew this may happen. And why is this progress? What did Gandhi teach us? First they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you. Then you win. Right? We're getting there. So where do we go from here? Just wrapping up now. Just wrapping up. So, there are some very clear policy changes that need to be introduced moving forward. Right? Drug companies can develop drugs, but they shouldn't be allowed to test them and then hide onto the raw data. Enough. Right? Enough of this now. This should not be allowed. Right? We need to change the law here. Regulators should not be funded by industry. I'm sorry. We need to dissociate from that. And the independent researchers should be involved in collecting data without commercial conflicts of interest, and then translating that data in a way that public can understand through informed consent. That's what it's about. And then counter tactics to the corporation. This is a very good book if you want to look at this, right? So the public health needs to refocus. We need to refocus on the social and commercial determinants of health. Right? Rather than just looking at individual risk factors in the consultation room. I'm not saying they're not right, but that's where we're going to get the big change in the population. And redesign the corporation. And Abraham Lincoln, this is something that's been going on for many, many years. When America was founded, it was founded on the basis of taking on and resisting British colonialism, which was basically being influenced by the East India Company. So we know what can happen if you have corporations who are really controlling, pulling the strings and controlling government. And he said, I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavour to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. Right? We need to think about going back to the basics of going back to the Vedic test, spirituality, right? What does it mean to be human? In the last 2,500 years since the Buddha was around, we've progressed technologically, but we've not progressed psychologically. We've gone backwards, right? And you can't have optimal physical health without having optimal mental health, right? So what does it, the late Robert Kennedy, the father of Robert Kennedy Jr., he says even then he knew this, and maybe that's one of the reasons why he was assassinated, right? He says the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. So listen, this is what it comes back to. We have to lead the good and happy life. Our ancient philosophers, Socrates, even Buddha taught us this. Ancient wisdom, right? You have to live in a virtuous way. That's how we need to start. Knowledge should be secondary to virtue. Knowledge is part of it, but it's showing secondary. What are the values we are teaching our children? And of all the virtues, courage is the most important. Because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. So people need to dare to be wise, but also be wise enough to dare. Right? Speak the truth. Remember, we're fighting for humanity here. And as Gandhi said, it is health that is the real wealth, not pieces of gold and silver. It's time to rise up against this organization of misery, and rights are only won by those who make their voices heard. Hope is never silent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Aseem Malhotra.